I would like to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. A particularly warm welcome to the many who are here with us for the first time. 14 years ago, the Institute for Religion and Science was established to promote the constructive engagement of religion spirituality with science technology, and to encourage a dialogue that is interfaith, multi-science, and civil. To this end, we sponsor lectures, a reading circle, and other events. Do check our website for resources, particularly for past videos and for our blog. Also, be sure to sign up for our mailing list to help you stay aware of upcoming programs. Now I will turn things over to Sister Kathy Duffy.
Good evening to all of you. My name is Sister Kathleen Duffy, and as director of the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's event. As Patrick mentioned, our institute has been providing lectures and programs for 14 years now, and so it's wonderful to have you with us. This evening, we have invited Sister Libby Osgood and several authors of the chapters in an edited volume called Green Saints for a Green Generation. Green Saints is a remarkable book written by emerging scientists, theologians, and sisters who are not only terribly concerned about the state of the environment, but also passionate about finding ways to inspire folks to respond wholeheartedly to the problem. In each chapter, one of the 12 authors shares details about a saint who, for her, epitomizes the kind of spirit and dedication needed for us if we want to make a difference in our world, especially in caring for the health of our planet Earth. This evening, Libby will introduce the evening and share details about the life of her saint, the one who has inspired her ecological concern. And she will then invite her chapter authors, Celia Ashton, Amirah Orozco, and Flora Tang, to do the same. Once all have shared, Libby will lead the group in discussion. While you're listening, a question or comment might arise, might come to your mind. If it does, please take a moment to write it in the chat, because after the discussion, we will open the floor for questions, and I'll try to gather as many questions as I can or comments so that we can pose them to the panel and allow them to engage the questions. So let me begin by introducing my friend Libby Osgood, a remarkable woman in many ways. Dr. Libby Osgood is a religious sister of the Congregation of Notre Dame de Montreal. A former practicing engineer, helping with a few of the NASA's projects, Libby is now Associate Professor of Engineering at the University of Prince Edward Island, teaching sustainable design engineering, and well respected not only for her teaching ability and her engagement in research, but also for the beautiful way she works with her students. Libby is a member of the American Teilhard Association, co-editor with Kathleen Dignan of Teilhard de Chardin, a book of hours put out by Orbis in 2023, and quite a scholar of Teilhard. Proud of the fact that she has already read all of Teilhard's work in chronological order at least twice. Libby, Celia, Flora, and Amirah, we are so pleased to have you here with us. So let us all welcome our friends to the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College. Libby.
Thanks, Kathy. That was quite the introduction.
You deserve it.
I'm so excited to be here talking about this book, Green Saints for a Green Generation. And I'm often, I forget whether the title is Green Saints for a Green Generation or Green Saints from a Green Generation, because it could just as equally be both. I do love Teilhard, and I'm so happy to be a part of this organization and where it has really fostered my ecological sensibility that wasn't as prominent, I would say, before really being introduced to Teilhard. It's really grown with my knowledge of him, and because he speaks so much of finding God through the earth. And I feel like I can talk about him just a little bit because he sneaks into both the intro and my chapter, even though neither are on him. But Celia Ashton, who we've invited today, he sneaks into her chapter too. So hopefully we'll hear more about Teilhard from her chapter. But to start at the beginning, the book Green Saints for a Green Generation was born out of this realization that as a sister and an engineering instructor, um, our congregation of Notre Dame of Montreal, one of our areas that we're working in is care for our common home, which, Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si popularizes that phrase. And as a sister and an engineering teacher, what does that mean for me? How can I actually live that in my mission? So what I sought out to do was to figure out what are the ways in which the foundress of our congregation, St. Marguerite Bourgeois, who came over to Canada from France in 1653, at the time when it was not yet called Canada. She came to Ville Marie in what is now Montreal. What could she teach us about being ecological? Because, we think about the ecological saints and we think about St. Francis. And then for most people, the list is done. They might think of Hildegard, they might think of Clare, they might think of Kateri Tekakwitha here, our first Indigenous saint in North America, or I guess in Canada, US, I should say. But really, it's such a short list. And I think that the saints have so much more to tell us and to teach us about being ecological. So I started to write an academic paper about what are the 6 indicators of an ecological saint. Really, I wanted to talk about Marguerite's ecology, but I couldn't find anything in the literature about what is an ecological saint? Who are they? And that kind of stunned me. And through my experience with writing the Book of Hours with Kathleen Degnan, I was so mentored, so beautifully mentored, and she just demystified the book making process for me, that even though I have a few other books in my brain of what I want to come out, I realized, no, we have to put those on hold because this is far too exciting of a venture that I want to share with others. So I realized we need more about the ecological saints. And rather than me just arbitrarily write a book and a different chapter on different saints, I really wanted to get more people involved with who are the saints that are meaningful to them. And so as a result, what you'll see in the book is 12 chapters from 12 different people, women, theologians, scientists, sisters, all with different cross sections of experiences, talking about a saint who inspires them. And what's really neat is that it's not just canonized saints. The first half of the book are canonized saints, the Desert Mothers, Juan Diego, Marguerite Bourgeois, John of the Cross, as you'll hear today, as well as Clare of Assisi and Ignatius. But I also wanted to leave room for who are the emerging saints? Who are the ecological witnesses who can inspire us to better action, who can give us hope in these times of desolation when it's really, really hard to care about the environment? And so the second half of the book is devoted to ecological witnesses. So for example, Toni Morrison, who many people didn't even know is Catholic, but when you read her books through an ecological lens, my gosh, is she an ecological witness, leading us to be more inspirational, to hope, to care for the earth. The environment it's a character throughout every book of hers, really. And Larissa does a beautiful job of pulling that out. And then there's a number of other saints in there who speak about the different witnesses, one of whom is still alive today, and she's working in the Amazon, an Indigenous woman working in the Amazon to protect what is left there, fighting mining operations and things like that. So because the ultimate chapter, the 12th chapter, is on how we are all called to be ecological saints. And so talking about the biodiversity and how we can't lose this precious biodiversity that Pope Francis talks about in Laudato Si, in order to preserve that it is part of Catholic social teaching to be ecological ourselves and to get involved. So chapter 12, every single one of us is in there to say, and we must act too. We must do things. So that's kind of the intro to the book. So the Green Saints part is, I described quite well. The For a Green Generation or From a Green Generation it's all written by people, 50-ish and under kind of thing, of people from the time that my entire life I have known that we are in an ecological crisis. And that has only gotten worse since Greta has made us that much more aware of it and spoken very loudly about it. So I consider myself on the cusp of the millennials, an elder millennial, they say. And Gen Z, it's only gotten more dramatic. My earliest memory is of a commercial of a fish in a pool of water, and the water just goes down and down and down. And this was on PBS, of this poor fish because I was brushing my teeth too long, is what the commercial is. So like, we never not knew a time when we weren't worried about the environment. So now is the moment for us to take the work that our forebears have done to say, now it's our turn. Now it's our turn to do something. So we could be called a green generation because we've only ever known this time of ecological disruption. So it's kind of our turn. But rather than this being about something sad or desolate, it's about how do we be hopeful? How do we do more? So a very quick description of my chapter of Saint Marguerite, because I wanted to really represent the book more than the particular chapter on Marguerite. But what I find Marguerite so inspiring is the chapter is on her radical humility. And so this is kind of what we mean by taking this green gaze and looking at someone in a different way through an ecological lens. So this woman who lived in 1653, she wouldn't have been saying she was ecological because you just were surrounded in the forest, the denseness of Canada. And so there are three things that I found that really inspire me from her witness. And one is her equality and openness. Our congregation had Indigenous women, had women from America, Canada, French Canada, and from France. So 4 different places. And that was kind of a really big thing. So if we could all be so humble to work towards equality and be open to the other. Another is she talked quite a bit about creatureliness. And just really loved animals and loved creatures and saw God, just like Teilhard, saw God through the earth in many, many forms, particularly Mary for her. But and then thirdly, she talked about, I demonstrated how to live simply, how to be humble. She always talked about pumpkins and cabbages, be as simple as pumpkins and cabbages, because that's what got them through those harsh Canadian winters. But to act boldly, that we can't just sit back. And I think that's a really important message for us today. So the last thing that I want to highlight is that we had the foreword written by Elizabeth Johnson. She agreed to write the foreword for us because I took an ecological spirituality theology course from her last semester teaching at Fordham, and really introduced me to what are all of these ologies, the theologies. And I think she did a lovely job. So I'd like to thank her and mention too Robert Ellsberg, our editor, and Orbis Books, our publisher. And Jen Norton is an artist who did the cover work for us, which I think re-envisions the spirit of the joy, the hope of taking something that is long been seen, like the Beatitudes, and re-envisioning it. So that was a long way to say, this is what our book is about. And that's a little bit about how Marguerite might be able to inspire us towards ecological action. And as Kathy said, we'll go through, Flora will speak to us, and then Amirah, and then Celia, and then we'll get into a panel discussion and then questions from the audience. So please do, if you have questions, please go ahead and pop those in throughout. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Flora X. Tang, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Notre Dame in Peace Studies and Theology. She is originally from Beijing, China. Flora studies theology of intergenerational trauma, diaspora, and decoloniality. Her popular writing can be found in the National Catholic Reporter and America Magazine. Her chapter is entitled, and it's the first chapter in the book after the intro, so it's fascinating. The Desert Mothers and Our Mothers: Desert Spirituality as Ecological Praxis in Everyday Life. Flora, please take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. It is just so good to be with you all and to be welcomed into this really beautiful space. Like Libby mentioned, my chapter focuses on sort of two sets of figures, right? Both the more historical, if you say canonized saints of the Desert Mothers, as well as like thinking about the parallels with our own either mothers, grandmothers, or the women in our own lives. So many of us here may already be familiar with the Desert Mothers and Desert Fathers from the 4th and 5th century. These are ascetics who lived their lives in the desert in what is present-day Middle East. And these monks, as well as women, devoted their lives to prayer, to simplicity, to being one with God, and being one with the earth and its resources, as well as to a life of voluntary poverty. So giving up their wealth to live very simply. And because their lives, right, happened such a long time ago, very little is known about the lives of these women, aside from a collection of words that have been passed down. So my chapter does talk about, what are the spiritualities, the desert spiritualities of simplicity of these women, but also turns to the witness of the many mothers and grandmothers in our own lives as people whose habit and spirituality that we may emulate, no matter what age we are right now, in our current age of ecological urgency. Right? And how I got there, right, was thinking about how, for people who are my generation, I would say like younger millennial, almost Gen Z, we tend to think of living ecologically as something that is reserved for people who are wealthy, people who are privileged, right, people who are those of us who are living here in the Western world who have access to quote unquote green resources. And in some sense, this is really real, right? Like this is also reflective of the ways that these quote unquote green lifestyles in our age of both ecological urgency and capitalism has really been marketed to us, where vegetarian products have a low price premium at restaurants, where greenwash products made of bamboo are more expensive at Target. And people in my generation in particular, right, we live on social media and we tend to think of our ecological or green lifestyles as something that must be Instagrammable, right? It has to look really cute. It has to fit the aesthetic really well. Like we have to like go with a really clean, simple aesthetic. But I'm trying to say that this needs not to be the case, right? The desert mothers, their love for voluntary poverty and for the earth, as well as our own mother stories, remind us that our care for the earth is deeply intertwined with not only our care for the poor, right, but also, right, the poor themselves, people who are historically and present day under-resourced, really demonstrate for the rest of us what it means to rely on the earth, as well as to love deeply the earth's limited resources. And we see this especially in our own mothers' lives, especially if we think of immigrant mothers, poor mothers across this country and globally, as well as mothers in the developing world who are already using the earth's resources really wisely and sparingly to feed their children. So my chapter tells stories of mothers in my own life who convert, backyard lawns, which is what we're very used to in the US, to vegetable gardens to feed our families better. Or mothers, this might be familiar to many of us here in this room, who save up plastic bags and like yellowish plastic Tupperwares under our sinks to use them over and over again. Or mothers around the world who put every single part of a vegetable that they harvest, from core to peel to stem, so things that I would otherwise easily throw away, to really good use to feed like their own little ecosystem in their gardens, right? So while we might think of, ecological ways of living as really trendy and new and clean and very like beautiful, but this is perhaps how many of our mothers and grandmothers, especially those from around the world, have always lived for generations, right? So these like seemingly old-timey habits that like sometimes I'm embarrassed that my mom and my grandma does, are in fact like part of this witness, the cloud of witness of green saints that can guide us in this era of not only rapid climate change and ecological urgency, but also during times of economic recession as well, where through voluntary simplicity or in the reusing of resources, we can better learn to feed on one another, to feed the earth, as well as like to think about how we can allow the earth to feed all of its children and not just those who are the most privileged. I would add just really quickly on an academic level, right? I'm really concerned as usual in the rising sort of blind faith in what is we call techno-futurism or techno-salvationism. So the belief that really fancy technologies and wealth and really transformative new innovations can save us, can save the earth. And I think like some of this love for amazing new technologies is like super important. But also it becomes sometimes dangerous if we put our entire faith in like grand transformative schemes and also forget at the same time that, in order for these things to happen, that we also need to transform our own hearts and our own everyday actions, and to really convert, right, to this desert spirituality of voluntary simplicity, and to giving up our excess wealth, especially as we live in the US, so that others can be fed. So I'll just close on a couple of, reflective questions and thoughts, right? As I've reflected on the desert mothers, I'm also increasingly aware that there's many deserts in our own lives, from spiritual deserts of feeling despair at, this climate disaster in our world, to material deserts, food deserts in our cities, where places where water is like literally scarce. So something that I invite you all and myself to reflect on is just thinking about, how can we pray with and for the many deserts that are in our lives and in the world, as well as how can we like the desert mothers, and like the green saints who are our mothers or motherly figures, continue to love God, love other people, and love the earth in the many ways that may be small and unglamorous and simple and even like ugly in some sense, right? So yeah, so I'll stop there, and I'll turn to our next speaker, my friend Amirah Orozco, and I'll briefly introduce her. So Amirah is a systematic theology PhD candidate at the University of Notre Dame, where she studies and writes on feminist, especially Latina and Mujerista theologies. She is originally from the border between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. She earned her bachelor's degree in philosophy and Master of Theological Studies at Boston College. Her chapter is entitled Our Lady of Guadalupe and Juan Diego, a model of ecological conversion in the Nican Mopohua. So I'll turn it over to Amirah now.
Thank you. Thank you, Flora. And thank you all for all of you who are here, but also to Sister Kathy and to Patrick for having us here. It really is an honor, and I'm happy to discuss this stuff with people who are also interested in it. I also she got a shout out earlier, but Larissa Harrington is another one of our colleagues who is a really close friend and who was, I think, the original connector for me to this project. And so I'm really grateful for her in the way that she sort of invites us into thinking in these new ways. So as Flora's already introduced my chapter on Guadalupe, as an instructor I was an instructor at Marian University's Renovación Parroquial, which is a really interesting program if any of you are interested in looking into it. I taught a module though there on Catholic social teaching, and it was to parish leaders who were really, for a lot of them, for the first time receiving formal theological training. They had been catechized by their parishes, oftentimes most of them in Mexico, some of them in Central America, when they were teenagers, but for the most part, their concepts of Catholicism were informed by what academics call popular religion or popular piety. And so one principle, to say it in that way, of Catholic social doctrines that got little attention in their ways of thought was the care for our common home. I taught this module twice, and both times in classes of 60 people, maybe one or two students knew that the Catholic Church taught that care for our environment was an important part of our own social imagination. Unlike human dignity, solidarity, the promotion of family, or peace, there was not a sense that care for our common home was deep in the fabric of our own faith and tradition. And even if they had heard of a document like Laudato Si, the care for our common home was nowhere in their own spiritualities. Amanda Ba, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, so if any of you know her, I apologize if I'm butchering her last name, but Baugh, published a book in November of 2024 entitled Falling in Love with Nature, The Values of Latinx Catholic Environmentalism. In it, she uses ethnographic approaches to expand on the idea of home-based conservationist methods, which she points out do not get deemed as environmental actions because they are carried out by working-class Latina folk. Reusing receptacles, and this goes a little bit to what Flora was saying too, but reusing receptacles over and over again, salsa and cottage cheese containers and sewing supplies and cooking tins are ways of living that are culturally bound and do work to reduce waste, and yet messaging around care for the environment tends not to point to impoverished and middle-class families as models of environmentalism. Another piece, though, that I think that makes the term environmentalism a sort of thorny application to Latina, especially impoverished Latina peoples, their actions and their worldview, is the same problem with calling the indigenous people of all of Latin America environmentalists. Environmentalism is, if it's taken in its sort of most narrow sense, is really the ideals of a social movement which started as a response to increasing research on the impacts of humans on our environment. Of course, for many indigenous people, and as Libby pointed out, for many people in the past in general, the care and respect for non-human life was not a response, but generally a way of life. Latina people have within us our own indigenous heritage, which sustains much of our spiritualities, especially. And now, while putting sewing needles in a cookie tin cannot be said to be a practice that we inherited through our Nahuatl or Quiche or Aymara or Quechua or any other indigenous ethnic groups' ancestors, I do think we can say that resourcefulness is a way of life which European individualism interrupted. On the other hand, though, Latinas are not immune to the forces of capitalism and neoliberalism, which promote overconsumption. And I think to say otherwise, I think, is to romanticize an entire group of people, which is very heterogeneous, right? As generations become more assimilated, US American culture and its good and bad have larger effects on Latinas. The political climate also increases the opportunity to view other things like the economy as more important when they're going to the ballot box. Now, I have been a lifelong Guadalupana, meaning that my devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe stretches far back into my own spiritual journey. Libby's invitation, which serves as the core one of this book, began to transform the way I looked at my most favorite devotion. I was never taught that Guadalupe was any sort of quote-unquote green saint, but from a young age, I was enamored by the beautiful roses that popped up around churches, in schools, and all around the borderland cities during the weeks of December. The story of the Nican Mapua, which is the 17th century document that tells the story of the apparition of Guadalupe to St. Juan Diego, which I knew so well, really shifted for me. Historians like Timothy Matavina have long pointed out the fact that the story was written for a Nahuatl audience, written in their language of an apparition that happened to one of their own. While scholars like Austin Cruz still debate what the purpose of this document is, it is undeniable that the Nican Mapua engages a worldview that had only recently come to know of the God of Jesus. If we take this as our starting point, which is not a controversial starting point, sort of in the scholarship on Guadalupe, and as well as it sort of accept Libby's invitation to see this with a green gaze, the document's own images of nature come to light in even more brilliant ways. In this paper, in this chapter, I try to think of the story of the Nican Mapua as an invitation into ecological conversion. This conversion, defined by Pope Francis by right relationship, ought to allow us to expand our imagination on our own role in the cosmos and the sacred bonds which tie us all together. And now I should say that the idea that this document, thinking about this document being all about conversion, is not my own insight. Virgilio Elizondo wrote about this in his 1997 book. Mother of a New Creation. It's a phenomenal book if you're looking even just for a spirituality book. It's a really, really good book. I concur with Elizondo that conversion, metanoia, seems to be the deepest theological reading of the Nican Mapua. Reading anything about turning away from sin, though, in this century must necessarily include a turning away from poor environmental practices as well. The flowers take on such a prominent role in popular piety because, of course, they play a prominent part in the narration. Flowers which appear in the freezing ground of winter brought to the bishop in Juan Diego's tilma are what seem to paint the tilma with the image of Our Lady, the one hanging today in the Basilica in Mexico City. When one begins to read it for these details, one notices also the birds are the first to call out to Juan Diego, and that the earth around Guadalupe is what indicates to Juan Diego of her divinity. And these three images form the basis of my reflections, taking them not as secondary, but as primary places in which the story unfolds. Guadalupe appears to a man for whom non-human creation was a big part of his own understanding of self, and so when she communicates to him, it is not only in his own language of Nahuatl, but also in his own language of divinity and sacredness. In reflections on the course by the students at the Marian University program that I taught, almost all of them pointed to this module where they got to explore spirituality of environmentalism as as one of the primary things that they were taking away from this class. As they read in Pope Francis's own words, they now understood differently that marveling at the beauty of the world around them was an act of praise for the God who created it. To care for that creation was an act of gratitude. I hope then that this piece reminds readers like them, or of course others, and even if only it's of one or two people, to take a walk outside and hear the birds chirping and see the flowers in whatever phase of life they are in. And when they do, that they are reminded that we are all connected and that God is truly good. And so I will introduce Celia, who will be our next speaker. Celia Ashton graduated from St. Joseph's University in 1999, with a Bachelor of Science in Biology. She graduated from the University of Maryland School of Dentistry in 2003 and was a practicing dentist for 10 years before entering the Carmelite Sisters of Baltimore in 2013. She is currently on a leave of absence from her religious community and is pursuing a Master of Theological Studies degree at Villanova University. Celia is interested in prayer as a way of transformation, healing, and societal change. Her chapter is entitled Clothed in God's Beauty, John of the Cross, and Revelatory Capacity of the Universe.
Thanks so much, Amirah. Good evening, everyone. I'm grateful to be participating in this conversation with all of you, and more importantly, to learn from all of you. I was grateful for Libby's invitation to contribute to a book that had the potential to help Pope Francis's writings on the environment become more widely received by all people of goodwill. I wrote with a particular concern for Christian believers. Like Pope Francis, I wanted to connect care for the earth with our deepest faith convictions. And I welcomed the challenge of trying to appeal to Christians who might be skeptical of the warnings that the scientific community has been hoping we would heed ever since the UN scientific conferences first raised the issue of the damaging effects of climate change in 1972. 53 years hence, scientists have opened our eyes to the wonder, awe, and beauty of the natural world, as well as to the way in which the earth is suffering from neglect and pillage. While we have ample motivation from a secular humanitarian perspective regarding why we should care for our common home, our faith and belief in God should impel us to do the same. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis highlights the efforts of previous popes to call us to a global ecological conversion. Quoting ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, Pope Francis writes that we are called as Christians to accept the world as a sacrament of communion. In my chapter, I draw upon the mystical insights of 16th century Spanish Carmelite saint and doctor of the Church, John of the Cross, who saw the natural world as the privileged and sacred place of encounter with God. John immersed himself in nature and saw in creation a trace of the divine. Through his beautiful poetry, John teaches that nature has the capacity to open us to the transcendent. Our tradition teaches that God is not the tree. However, John describes God as seemingly flowing through every leaf, which resonates deeply with my own experience and perhaps yours as well. Theologically speaking, the tree is both drenched in God and points the way to the fullness of God, in which the tree and I both participate. God is infinite being that is poured out in a dynamic relationship of love. As creatures, we share in God's infinite being in a finite way. All the created world of which humans are a part in some way images God, because everything in the created order participates in God's being. Put differently, the created world is a conduit for God's grace. As Eucharistic people who profess and celebrate God entering matter, we are called to embrace creation and to recognize our interconnectedness with it, instead of our destructive dominance over it. Two of the poems that I explore in detail in my chapter are the romances and the spiritual canticle. In his romances, John sings of the outflow of Trinitarian love in the person of Jesus that unites the created world to God. John intuits a deep interconnectedness with the created world, and he highlights the continuous flow of divine love from God's perspective, from the depths of Trinitarian life into the created world, so that the fullness of God can be revealed to creatures. Conversely, John's spiritual canticle is a beautiful ballad between the soul and Christ, in which the revelatory capacity of the created world reveals traces of a hidden God to the soul. For John, God is both sought and found in nature. All of creation speaks of God. John of the Cross recognized that nature is clothed in God's beauty and is therefore revelatory of God. For John, the visible beauty of creation reveals the risen Christ who pervades the entire cosmos. Like John of the Cross, Pope Francis recognizes that the world sings of an infinite love, and he asks, how can we fail to care for it? Since writing this chapter, I've spent the past semester taking a course on ecological conversion with Professor Christy Lang Harrelson at Villanova University, and I'm currently thinking about how Teilhard's law of complexity consciousness and the notion of deep incarnation could be potential pathways for ecological conversion. I'm asking questions such as, how does the life of the Spirit pervade the world, from without, from within, both without and within? I've come to recognize that conversion begins with an encounter or an awakening. In his commentary on stanza 4 of The Living Flame of Love, John of the Cross writes, "And here lies the remarkable delight of this awakening. The soul knows creatures through God, and not God through creatures." I've been thinking and praying about what it might mean to know creatures through God. And my sense is that it has to do with seeing as God sees and becoming full participants in the community of creation, living together in this beautiful sacrament of communion. Since we are interested in the intersection of faith and science, I will conclude with a beautiful question from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Does science allow us to perceive the sacred in the world, or does it bend light in such a way as to obscure it? It is not more data that we need for our transformation, but more wisdom. Kimmerer dreams of a world guided by a lens of stories rooted in the revelations of science and framed with an indigenous worldview, stories in which matter and spirit are both given voice. Back to you, Libby.
Thanks, Celia. And I'll just add spotlights to pull us all together onto the screen. And myself last, I guess. Okay, thank you all for explaining your chapters to us. I have to say, for those listening, we've gotten the chance to do this a couple of times through Zoom, and most of us haven't really met in person. So this is really the way that we're getting to know each other, which I think is really kind of fun. And I feel like I got to know quite a bit about each of your motivations tonight in a way differently than 6 months ago when this book came out. So all of you kind of touched on that a little bit, but I'm really wondering if you want to touch on what's something you've learned about your saint or about one of the others in the book from others receiving the book around you, if that makes any sense. Like, what have you learned in the last 6 months about this that you didn't know 6 months ago before we started it?
So you want to go first?
You do.
I mean, I think, well, so I'll say too, it's a great question, Libby, and also I'll take a jab at it. I'm not sure I know, but I think, I mean, one thing about the book, I hate to mention, I mean, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but Larissa's chapter I thought was really moving on Toni Morrison, and that like it was this sort of, I didn't know that she was Catholic, and I think that that's maybe something that should come up more often, but I think that the way that she sort of made sense, and Larissa even wrote a poem of her own in that chapter, which I found really beautiful, and like the way that sort of literature, I think, expands imaginations. And I think Toni Morrison for me was somebody who expanded my imagination in different ways, but it was really beautiful to read her chapter, and I think about it more through this sort of green gaze, which I think I've been thinking about that chapter for like since I read it all those months ago, you know. And then I think the one thing that just on the people reading the book and receiving it, I mean, one thing about Guadalupe that I think she's just everywhere, like she's just sort of ubiquitous in I think Latin American culture writ large, not even just Mexican culture at this point. And I think people are really open for her to be something that we need her to be in the moment. And so I've been really happy and excited by the prospect that like this person who, and Juan Diego as well, sort of these people who are so revered for us, really can be sort of like can expand our imaginations in these ways and sort of allow us to think in a new way of who we are, which I think has been a nice surprise to me.
I'm happy to go next, because I'll probably share a little bit, just like pretty briefly. I think one thing about like my saints or my cluster of saints, right, Desert Mothers, and then also Our Mothers, which is like intentionally vague, is just like how many beautiful stories I've received from different people, since they have read my chapter, or since I've like shared this book as a whole with other people, and just how many people are able to reflect with me, the stories of their own, the stories of their own mothers, women in their lives, and especially like, or other like immigrant populations such as my own. So that's just been really sacred and really beautiful to just hear how these same traditions of like living simply, of conserving our resources, like even if we're not like, actively living in poverty, right, has resonated across cultures. And it's something that, brings me and other people together. And I'll just briefly mention one of the chapters that I've actually taught with is chapter 11. So Rhonda Miska's chapter on Sister Laura and the Martyrs of the Amazon. So in my Christianity and peace building class, where I taught at the University of Notre Dame, we reflect on sort of the roles of what we call ecological peace builders or environmental peace builders. So people who are giving up their lives or deaths to protect the earth, as well as to make sure that the earth does not receive any more violence than it currently does, as well as the rural and indigenous people who are the most impacted by them. So it's been just such a joy and privilege to reflect on, just various ecological martyrs, especially the one mentioned in this book. So.
And I can just follow on all that to say, the rest of the chapters in the book are really terrific. And one thing in Flora's chapter that really struck me that she didn't mention is the notion of holy grief, because I think that's so important in our lamenting the various ways that the earth has been harmed and continues to be harmed. And she talked about waste colonialism, which was something I hadn't really thought too much about before, all the different, deserts that she named. So I just think that the notion of holy grief is a way that we can all kind of enter into the destruction that has happened, and to try to work towards reconciliation with the earth and transformation of our own, actions and attitudes towards how we care for the earth.
Yeah, and I one thing that I wasn't expecting, Flora, in your chapter, when you wrote it, you used examples of Palestine, and that was before the crisis that has been happening there. So I was kind of curious to see if anything would happen through the publication process in terms of having to revise or anything like that. So I've been really pleased to see the timeliness of what that chapter turned into. Because you write beautifully about Palestine and your experience there. Yeah. Kathy, I see the time. Would you like me to do one more question, or do you want us to?
Sure, that'll be good. And then that one more.
Okay, that's cool. I mean, I have to ask, right? Thinking about the time that we're in right now, the recent passing of Pope Francis, and how he really is the one who was the initiator of this project with Laudato Si from 10 years ago, that encyclical, and then Laudate Deum, y'all aren't listening, you know, that whole document. What are your thoughts on the need for witnesses and saints? And I found that in Laudato Si, he brings up like 13 different people that we should pay attention to because of their witnesses. So I'm just asking this more in general of the role of witnesses and people to follow.
I think witnesses are important, but I also think we need strong communities that can help support people who might be open to a change in perspective about how, you know, the ecological conversion that Pope Francis is calling us to. We need good communities where people can feel comfortable to change their minds and to change their behaviors towards the environment. And in the class I was taking on ecological conversion, we looked at Brian McCraney's book, How Minds Change. And one of the things that he speaks about is the need for the person to feel comfortable and safe in a community of like-minded individuals in order to really change one's mind. And so how can our various faith communities, our university communities, different groups, you know, how can we support ecological conversion by creating a safe place for which people can begin to change their mind about the earth?
I'll just chime in really quickly, something that I tell my students throughout my class. And they're like a group of, you know, all sorts of students, some feminists, some like not super religious. And we talk about why we study what we call the Christian tradition, which is one of the official names of our classes here at Notre Dame. And I always talk about how tradition is the memory that we are not walking alone. Right. And I think of the same as the roles of saints, capital S saints, lowercase saints, as well as our communities, friends, including all of y'all here, as just people and witnesses that remind us that in this ecological journey that we are not walking alone. And I think for, you know, what I was talking about in my chapter, it's so easy to feel like the small things that we're doing don't really matter. And sometimes like statistically that might be true. They don't like change the world. But I think having saints, right, remind us that like we are not doing any of these things alone.
Say something very similar to Flora X. I don't teach that class yet because I'm earlier in the program, but that's the sort of I think for me, coming from the very specific context, I think I sort of touched on it more when what I'm talking about today than in the actual chapter, but just in terms of like knowing that this is actually very deep in the tradition, that this is not something that while Pope Francis sort of elevated it into an encyclical, that there are sort of many witnesses that come before us, and that will more than likely come after us if it all survives, will come after us in ways that make it part of. It's not something that Pope Francis invented out of whole cloth, right? That there are people, including Teilhard, that create these sort of like ways of thinking about it from a Catholic perspective. And I really like Celia's John of the Cross too, right? So that this stuff, and you can think of Bonaventure too, but even when you're reading people like Augustine, right? Like you can sort of read this in the respect and care for creation that is really present throughout our tradition.
Thanks, Amirah and Flora and Celia. Kathy, I've added you to our little spotlight party here.
Thank you. It's a wonderful group to be part of. And I agree with you that that's probably one of the most important things, is to form groups get together and help people to encourage one another, because it's hard to do this alone. And it's not meant to be that way. So in encouraging the group, to write the book, I think you've encouraged more of that, not just among yourselves, but among us. But I see we have some comments and questions. The first is very interesting that Elizabeth is going to ask her husband to buy this book for her birthday. She's so taken by it. So, and we're hoping that the new Pope, she is hoping, and I agree with her, that the new Pope might read your book also. So that's a very nice comment. But here's a good question that I would say that it's my question too. How does a person overcome environmental fatigue? The unrelenting presentation of environmental collapse. Just to hear every night something terrible happening. How does one get the energy to overcome that so that you can move ahead in hope and continue to work for the good of the world? So who has the answer to that?
Who's teaching the theology course right now on it? Because this engineer isn't.
Good.
I don't have an
Oh, please.
but something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially this spring, is like just finding joy in nature. And I'm a big hiker. So I think like just like finding so much joy and awe in every different part of the earth's beauty that I see every time I go outside has been, not that it doesn't, not that it counters, right? Like Celia mentioned, the holy grief that I feel when I look at the world around me. But it does, like, it keeps me going, just like recognizing how much joy I feel when I'm connecting with the earth and just recognizing different parts of like the beauty of the soil, the beauty of like the earthworms, then digging around in my garden, and all these like small things to like the grandeur of mountains, which both, I don't know, increases my faith in God, and also awaken me again in these times.
Okay. That's great.
Well, and I'm gonna come back to the Tarot study that y'all were nice enough to include of mine about hope, because one thing Tarot writes a lot about hope, and I think that's why what really is foundational in this book is that each chapter is about hope and that we can move forward. And I think the opposite of fatigue, the opposite of desolation, truly is living into that hope. And the thing that I want to note is that hope's not easy. It's not empty. It's not optimism. It involves suffering, and Teilhard talks about the different ways that he suffered in his life, that there is suffering involved in hoping, in being a truly hopeful person, with the virtue of hope, but also that hope takes work, that we have to actively pursue it. It's not just about assuming good things will happen, as one of the authors mentioned earlier, that it really is, we have to put effort into it. So I think, as we talked earlier about finding community, things like the ATA, like finding these places that we can be revitalized and renewed, are so important these days. And I think it's so beautiful that there are more circles now. That's one thing Pope Francis has done for us, is there are so many more circles now where we do get to talk about this, and we aren't all the lone voices out there. So I find that very, very helpful. Kathy, can I talk about two, I know time-wise we're coming to the end, but I do have two kind of exciting things about the book that I'd love.
Okay. And
mention.
I want to ask one more question, but go ahead. You say.
Okay, I just wanted to say, because it's a new project and we're really excited about it, is we're working with the Mary Ward Center in Toronto right now to develop a kid's book, a kid's version of the
Oh,
Green.
good.
So we're working on it right now with some great illustrators in high school illustrators, to turn it into, and I can be a green saint too, so to be able to be palatable to a much younger audience, because I've been told that there are big words in here at times. So I'm really excited about that. And we were named by Spirituality and Practice as one of the top 20 spiritual books of 2024. So I just want to like emphasize the beautiful work that these authors did to make that happen. Thank you.
Okay, there's another question. Why don't we go a little bit, and if people need to go off, they can do that. But what's the panel's opinion of joining and supporting existing environmental groups, which are trying to banish ignorance, indifference, and inaction? And I guess that's one of the things I was thinking about too. So the groups, how do we form groups, but also how do we interest young people? Are young people interested in this? How can we, because actually, you know, us older people will be around for a bit, but it's up to you, and you're going to be the ones, you know, enduring this terrible disaster if it happens. So both of those, why don't we, you know, why don't you see if you can answer either one, you know, getting people together in groups and supporting one another. And also, you know, how do we involve more young people?
I can speak on this one, Celia, because I think the next question is from Patrick to you, and I would really like to hear you speak on that. So I'll take
Okay.
this question, and then you can take the more John of the Cross
Okay.
specific question. But I
Good.
mean, I think it's sort of related to the last question, but I mean, I didn't answer the last question because I'm not sure I've figured that out in my own life in terms of just more generally speaking, the political situation right now, I think, is one that often I find, and today is one of those days that is just
Mhm.
overwhelming to me. It's sort of apocalyptic in some ways, I think. And the sort of like broad sort of eschatological hope that I think I can have sometimes doesn't feel very concrete to me these days, even though I'm trying. I'm trying, and we probably are all trying. I mean, I think hope is obviously a big one. I'm as I read a lot of Latin, and my research is in Latin American liberation theologies, and I think hope plays a major role in thinking about what liberation is and the sort of like eschatological glimpses of what liberation can be on earth. But I think the eschatological glimpses I think are related to what I what the question is more concretely of these sort of like social movements, and that I think the social movements are social movements that are engaging environmentalism as a sort of core part of who they are, and Greta was mentioned earlier, I think are really, really important. And also the sort of like everyday life of it is also really important. But I think ultimately what's going to make a difference, because I think ultimately we can all agree that the sort of everyday life changes are not going to make any sense in as long as sort of companies are not being held responsible for what they're doing to the environment, right? And so I think that those social movements really are at the core of what, in the political and lobbying that happens, I really do think are probably the core of any sort of hope that I see. I'm involved in Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas, that mostly deals with migrants, but because of how many migrants are actually leaving their houses, and this goes unspoken about in the sort of narrative on immigration, but a lot of them are leaving their homes because of violence, but also because of lack of water, right, near their towns, right? And so those sort of people who don't get labeled as environmental refugees, but really are becoming increasingly an important part of what we think about when we think about migrants. And so yeah, I think young people do care, but I think it's how do you get them plugged in, and how do you get them frankly walking away from the promises of neoliberalism, of promises of money, right? I think that's a major, I working with young people here, I think that's a major part of what's going on. Yeah.
All very important to think about. We do have that question from Patrick for Celia. Speak a little more about John of the Cross and knowing creatures through God. A very interesting perspective, yeah. And you could add in a little on Teilhard too, if you wish.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for the question. I don't really have a complete answer, but I can share with you some of my musings up to this point. I think my chapter did a good job of showing how it is that we know God through creatures. And in the chapter, I talk about building a nest, that as we have these, we go out and we hear the birds, we see a beautiful flower, we're pulled out of ourselves. We have these moments of connection with God through the natural world. We slowly start to build this nest where this interior space within us opens. So in one way, it's like we're receiving, my question about, how does the spirit pervade the world? Is it from without? Is it from within? My sense is it's both. And I think that's to try to weave Teilhard into this a bit, that as matter complexifies, consciousness increases. The space, if we think about that space within us, that building that interior nest, that space where we become more and more, let's say, Capax Christi, more and more capable of receiving Christ's life within us. And that over time, not necessarily over time, but it ideally in spiritual growth, that area is expanded and we receive more and more of Christ's very relational nature. My suspicion is that John of the Cross is saying that, when we get to that point of what he calls awakening, that we're truly able to see as God sees, that we see ourselves, I think, as part of the community of creation, in a way that there's a real interconnection, a real mutuality. I'm not sure I know what that's like, but I hope, I'm hopeful that the day will come when I'll have a better experience of what John is really alerting us to the possibility for. But in Elizabeth Johnson's book, Ask the Beast, she talks about how the stewardship model isn't the most helpful model, because it basically is saying that humans have to mediate God to creatures. And I think in the community of creation, what we're saying is that each creature has a direct relationship with God, that humans, because when we see ourselves as the mediators of God, then we become, I think, we have a negative anthropocentrism that becomes dominant and destructive. And so I appreciate that section of her book. And at this point, I don't feel I'm being very articulate about it, but I feel like there is this connection for me of knowing creatures through God, in really, living out of that space of the community of creation, where we're respectful, and we see a real mutuality and reciprocity between the more than human community, as you might, one way to characterize that.
Cool, thank you. And so this has been wonderful. I think we will have to stop now, but it's really been wonderful, and I really appreciate it. Getting a deeper sense of these, the ecological saint that we each need to be, and how we have to stay hopeful. That we have to find ways to stimulate that joy, as you were saying, Flora. It's not gonna happen unless we dream and unless we have hope. And so dream away. And so thank you for your wonderful work with the book. And I hope everybody goes and buys it. And I know our congregation, we had a reading circle, and we went through the book, and people really loved it. We're going to have a retreat next summer, and 2 of our sisters are going to work with the content of the book, and so promote it in whatever way you can. I know you will, but for us, us, the audience. But it's really been great. And so thank you again for coming. And I just want, before we leave, see if I can do this. I want to show you some things that we're thinking about doing in the future. Some of them you saw before in the ad coming in, but let me see if we can do this. This is an event we're having again with the same theme, eco apocalypse in the unfinished universe, Teilhard's evolutionary hope with Catherine Keller. if we're having a weekend retreat, Catherine will be there the whole weekend, but will be, she'll, be lecturing between 12 and 2 on Saturday, May 31st. And so you can join us for that. Catherine's an amazing process theologian, very interested in Teilhard as well as Whitehead. And I think, it should be just an amazing weekend together. And then we have a new book on Teilhard with some essays in it by his family, his granddaughter, grandniece, and his grandnephew. And then there are a couple retreats and things. These are different events that are, that we're doing. This is a retreat program I'm doing tomorrow night. One that I'll be doing in October, I think it is, and some reading circles. We look at Teilhard's work and, converse with him. And so these are the reading circles. And a couple retreats that I'm doing on Teilhard. So what I would say is, if you're interested in any of that, do get in touch with me. My email is very easy, kduffy@chc.edu. Go to our website. If you know how to spell Teilhard's name, it's teilharddechardin.org. And I hope you'll, join us again, and, let me know if you need anything or want to be on the mailing list. And so best wishes, and come back again. All right. So thank you very much.